What's up everybody, Steven here with Neural DSP. And today I'm starting the very first of the FAQ series. I want to use this series to address the most popular questions that we get on a fairly regular basis. And if you have any questions that you want to be addressed, go ahead and leave them in the comments down below. So let's go ahead and jump into the questions. I'll go ahead and leave timestamps so that way you guys can more easily find the answers that you're looking for. Question 1. What's the best audio setup for the standalone plugins? So I suppose this will be a two-part answer, and I'll try and run through this as quickly as I can. This will answer the question about setup and also a couple of questions about crackling and latency issues. Now let's go ahead and open up our standalone plugin. We'll start by clicking the cog in the bottom left of our plugin. Now the first thing that we have to attend to is the audio device type, which is almost always going to be ASIO. Next, audio devices, click the drop-down menu and make sure that you have the device selected that you want to be using. I have a Focusrite Scarlett 18920, so I'm going to use the Focusrite USB ASIO. Now we select our audio inputs and our outputs. Make sure that you have the correct input selected because my guitar is coming into input 3. Now you have the option of clicking two separate inputs. This is for if you have a second person that wants to jam, you'll actually be able to then click out of the audio settings menu and go to stereo. What this will do is it'll separate your two signals into left and right. So if you're the only guitar player, you're going to want to make sure that only the single input is selected. Make sure you have the correct outputs, and then moving on to sample rate and audio buffer size. Now this is where you can either get latency or crackling. More often than not, crackling is actually a symptom of your CPU being overworked. So let's talk a little bit about sample rate. Sample rate is how many times a second your audio driver is sampling the signal of your guitar. The higher the sample rate, the more accurate the digital signal will be, but you sacrifice CPU power at the expense of fidelity. After that, you start getting diminishing returns because it'll start eating up your CPU power, but your ability to hear the difference will start to diminish because the human ear, aside from some various outliers, isn't really capable of hearing those differences. So as you can see, at 44.1 kilohertz, the archetype of Bossy is only taking up around 2.2 to 2.4% of my CPU. Now, my rig is a beast and it can take a lot of punishment because it's the i9 9900K processor. So if I was to actually bump my 44.1 up to double, which is 88.2 kilohertz, let's see what it does to my CPU. So it's not exactly doubling my CPU power, but you can see that it's actually straining my CPU just a little bit more. So after this, we have to decide on our audio buffer size. The audio buffer size is how quickly the CPU processes the audio that's incoming and then pushing it out so that way you can hear it through your monitors. So at 88.2 kilohertz and 1024 samples, I get 11.6 milliseconds of latency. If I'm just playing chords, this isn't going to be very noticeable. However, if I'm playing any sort of technical or speedy kind of metal, then I'm definitely going to notice the difference. So what I do after that is I start lowering the buffer size to a latency that can be tolerable to playing metal. However, again, the lower the buffer size, the more stress it's going to put on my CPU. So if I go down to 16 samples, which is 0.2 milliseconds, so now my CPU is bumped up to 7.2 to 7.4, 7%. So roughly around 7% CPU power. Okay, so I'm starting to get some crackling sounds from my archetype of Bossy. So it really doesn't take the CPU being maxed out for you to start getting some crackling. So let's go ahead and open up the audio dialog box again and make sure that we are on the correct settings. So let's go ahead and go to 256 samples and see if that corrects it. So now that I have my sample rate and my audio buffer size set, I can look at my MIDI input devices. Now I have my Behringer FCB 1010 plugged into the back of my Focusrite Scarlett 18920. So I'm going to go ahead and select Focusrite USB MIDI to make sure that the plugin is listening to the Focusrite device to receive MIDI messages. Now, if I wanted to have my MIDI keyboard being the one to send MIDI messages to my plugin, then the option would appear in this box and I would check that instead. Question 2. how can I use third-party impulse responses in conjunction with Neural DSP impulse responses? Now, if you've dug into the impulse response section on any of these plugins, you can see that you can load your own custom impulse response. However, sometimes you'll run across problems like this. The problem is that these two impulse responses are not phase aligned. Now, I'm not going to get too far into the weeds about phase alignment, but the really easy answer to this question is that some companies supply what are called MPT impulse responses. MPT stands for minimum phase transformed. It's basically an attempt to take phase information out of an impulse response so that way third-party impulse responses can play nicely with each other. So I went ahead and purchased a couple of Ownhammer's impulse responses to make this demonstration. So this first example you listened to was one of Ownhammer's impulse responses blended with a Ribbon 160. Now let's go ahead and listen to the MPT version of this exact same impulse response. So this is the PSA of this particular episode. When you're messing around with mixing and matching impulse responses, especially on high gain guitars, it's always best to take frequent breaks. I've seen it in forums, I've seen it in comment threads where engineers and people who are new to this spend hours trying to shape a guitar tone or a bass tone, and then they come back to it the next day and they completely hate it. It's because your ear is desensitized to frequencies so quickly that it becomes imperative not only to save your hearing, but also to maintain perspective on the tones you're working on to take frequent breaks. So now, back to the point. So then the question becomes, what if you're given a non-MPT impulse response? I am going to go off on a little bit of a tangent on this one though, because I want to caution you on this next step. With this next solution, you can get some pretty good responses, but it can become a routing nightmare and a horrendous time sink. So with that in mind, I usually ask myself the question, is flipping through several libraries of impulse responses just to see which one's going to mesh the best a good use of my time? To me, it's about circumstances. If you're working for a big label and you have the budget and the time to do so, then fall down the rabbit hole as far as you want to go. These are the tones that the band wants to hear, so take your time and really develop their sound into something that can last forever. But if this is just something for fun, or maybe it's a demo, or maybe it's just a hobby, then maybe you should be concentrating on the things that are going to be getting the most return on your investment or the most bang for your buck. Because then you might get bogged down in the details, suffer from analysis paralysis, and then just not release your music to begin with. Having tons of IRs to choose from is fun, but spend time on the things that will get you the most return on your investment. Then, if time allows, work sparingly on the tiny details afterwards. So now, back to the point. I have my guitar track going to my Archetype Nolly head section, and then I have that guitar signal being split between two aux inputs. One of those aux inputs has a Dynamic 57 and the Dynamic 421 on it. On the other aux input, I chose the Torpedo Wall of Sound plugin to control my impulse response. Now this is just one example of an impulse response loader that you can use. You can also go with Pulse, which is free, or you can go with Miko from ML Sound Lab. Either way, any of these are going to give you great control over the phase of your impulse responses. Now the Wall of Sound does have this Verify knob, which is pretty cool because it allows you another aspect of control over the phase of your impulse response. So I'm going to go ahead and choose the Nolly Zilla, which is actually one made by Adam Nolly Get Good. So to start, we have the Archetype Nolly track going into the Archetype Nolly impulse response. Okay, so let's go ahead and start blending in this Nolly Zilla cab impulse response into our Archetype Nolly track. So now, just to check our work, we're going to go ahead and flip the phase on this just to make sure that it fits. Question 3, can I use multiple Neural DSP plugins on a single duplicated guitar track? The answer to this question is fairly similar to the previous impulse response question. If you duplicate guitar tracks and use a different Neural DSP plugin on both, you're probably going to run into phase problems. Unfortunately, I've done a lot of experimentation over the last couple of days, and I have not found a very viable solution. Now, these 3 questions actually took up a lot of my time, so I'm actually going to keep all the rest of the questions that I had planned for this Q&A for the next one. So if your question didn't get answered in this one, go ahead and look forward to the next one. Thank you so much for checking out this video. Please like, share, and subscribe, and hit that bell icon for notifications on when we upload our videos. Comment down below. Let me know if you have any questions for future Q&As. And as always, I'll see you in the next video.